All right, thank you so much. Our next conversation is going to be with Sandra MacQuillan from Mondelēz. My name is Emma Cosgrove. I'm a reporter with Supply Chain Dive, where we cover freight logistics, operations, and procurement. And first off, I'll let Sandra introduce herself, and then we'll get to the grilling.
Hi, I'm Sandra MacQuillan. I have the great honor of heading up the Mondelēz supply chain, and I've been in the company now for a year. Previous to that, I was in Kimberly-Clark for 4.5 years, setting up their supply chain. And before that, I was a Martian in Mars for about 20 years, doing a variety of roles around the world, actually. Lived in 6 or 7 different countries, worked from local, regional, global, and through the corporate world as well, having a complete adventure with my husband and my son until we ended up in North America, which is where we are now.
All fascinating supply chains that we won't have time to delve into today.
Just giving you a taster.
Yes, oh, I'm tantalized. Today we'll mostly focus on the last 6 months, but obviously please feel free to expound beyond the last 6 months if you can remember anything before that.
Nope, that feels like 6 years, so nope.
So CPG companies like Mondelēz were some of the first to make actual changes to their operations to really make sure they're getting on the shelf, which is #1 in the pandemic with all the stockouts and grocery shelves empty. So I'm wondering if you could just tell us what those early moves were and how you realized that you needed to make them.
Yeah, so we probably only had a couple of things that we really changed. And first and foremost, it was making sure that our people were safe. So the people in our factories and our front line in sales and other parts of the organization, which are really sort of more in that frontline essential space that they had to work in. So we spent a lot of time immediately making sure we had safety protocols, PPE, and the kind of testing and ensuring that people felt safe to come to work and also felt safe whilst at work. And we also bridged that out to people's families, because community and cultures, and we're a global company, so we operate in hundreds of countries. Making sure that people understood what they needed to do in work as well as outside work, so to protect their family and themselves in all ways. By default, in doing that, you also then, of course, you protect your business. You have business continuity because you've got people who feel safe to come to work. They know that they're being looked after there, therefore they come. And so then you can continue your business operation in a way that delivers what the customers and consumers want. So that was the first shift, which we've always protected our people, but the first shift was really about reinforcing that and putting in place physical barriers and physical capability to look after people, and then making sure that they had the medical advice and knowledge that they might need. The second one was that we saw a massive shift in our consumer needs, which is what you're talking about. What did we shift there? And we found that most of our consumers were going back to the brands that they love and feel connected to. So we saw a shift from some of our less well-known brands probably, or ones that were just quite young in their evolution, back to the Oreos, the Ritz, the Cadbury Dairy Milk, the real core of what we are. And that clearly puts a shift and a strain onto your supply chain, because almost overnight we'd shifted to a different portfolio. So what we did was we looked at how can we simplify the portfolio that we're operating today to give us more capacity and capability to supply what our consumers want, and how do we connect with our customers to make sure that we get it to them in the right time and the right place. So those are probably the 2 key things that we did, which actually endure even through the pandemic and the crisis that we've been operating in.
Yes, I'm wondering if you could speak to that sort of portfolio condension or just SKU trimming, because it seems like that a lot of Mondelēz especially perhaps, but also a lot of CPG companies have made a similar move and realized, hey, this is a good idea. We should do this anyway. So do you feel like this was a sort of a long time coming, or is it just something you've realized lately?
So I think it's probably been a bit of both. And I would say that very blatantly, we've used a crisis to actually accelerate a direction that we would have wanted to go in anyway, really. If you look at the supply chain, then clearly simplifying as much as we can and focusing in on what the consumer really wants makes it as easier, not necessarily easy, but easier than it has been before. So we are actually going through, and I know Derek, our CEO, has talked about this externally as well, we're going through a 25% reduction in SKU production in our portfolio, which is huge in terms of what we're doing. It's massive. A global company, $26 billion, you can imagine, a lot of local only, but not only. And then we've also cut back by about 25% on the new product development, because really making sure again that that's connected to the consumer. So what's the consumer insight and what does the consumer want and how do we translate that? So by default, that allows you to more rapidly respond to changes in the demand profile with less noise in the system. And it also allows you to manage your investment profile and get behind A&C in brands that you know and love very well, but might have been spreading your resources more thinly. So it's been a moment. We spent some time as a leadership team talking about how can we turn this crisis into something positive? How do we emerge stronger from this? And these two areas were areas that we focused on, which actually benefited everyone.
Yes, I've spoken to so many supply chain managers and leaders who just started salivating when they realized this was the moment to put all the SKUs. Yes.
We've still got too many, but it's okay now.
Sure. Sure. Besides customers or consumers shifting some of the products that they buy, they've also been shifting online, which, I mean, you have to be living in a hole not to know that was happening. So it's always been kind of a mystery to me how that rebounds to a company as large as Mondelēz. Could you speak to that channel shift and what happens?
Sure. So for us, it's not really a shift actually, because e-commerce, omnichannel, that sort of kind of perspective has been part of what we've been looking at anyway. So we've been, for a long time now, been looking at how do we play well in the e-commerce channel, both with our customers and also direct to our consumers. So it's not new, but of course the shift again has been rapid. So we haven't changed any of our strategies. All our strategies remain the same. You know, we want to empower people to snack right. So how do we get the snacks to the space that they're in? And how do we move backwards from that to make sure we do it in the most efficient and effective way? The fact that more percentage of what we do is in that bit actually just helps us really. Hasn't been a huge volatile, turbulent move for us. It's more about just refocusing to make sure we've got the resources in the right place.
Gotcha. So if you were set up for a heavy dose of digital business, I'm wondering if you could just give me the top 2 or 3 moves you'd already made that put you in such a good position.
Yeah, right. So we've been talking about it for a long time, and we connect across marketing, R&D, the business units and supply chain on what we need to do. So we look at the supply chain. So what do they need to do? And a lot of the complexity comes in the last mile, as you know, or in the way that you choose to deliver. So it's been more about connecting. How do we digitally market differently to make sure that we get our message in a world that's really diverse and very busy actually? How do we make sure that we get the investment right to be able to market in that space? And then how do we effectively get the products where they need to be it right to the front door or to the pantry or into a space that one of the distribution centers that it needs to be for others to deal with. So that's sort of where we've always been looking and really connecting and understanding what the consumer's similarities are in their differences. And there's not really a lot of difference apart from sometimes the convenience and the route to market that you're talking about. So I think it's more in how do you portray the message of what your brand stands for in that space.
Gotcha. Yeah. And the rest is customer to customer. I would assume lots of nuance there. Great. Okay. So shifting gears completely. But importantly, one of the things that customers are demanding from companies like Mondelēz is more progress and transparency around sustainability initiatives, deforestation, climate change, et cetera. But the pandemic has thrown off some of the sort of infrastructure behind those efforts, like supplier audits have been massively disrupted, especially in countries that have had a fair bit of virus to deal with themselves. So how do you maintain progress toward emissions reduction, deforestation, cessation goals without, with the structure around those sort of compromised and shifting?
Yeah. So in the supply chain, in Mondelēz, we spent a lot of time looking at, well, why are we here? And we actually have a vision and a mission that says, do it right from shelf to field, and talks about the shelf back to the field deliberately. So you start with the consumer and you come back. And we have elements of that strategy that are non-negotiable, and sustainability is one of those elements where we are not prepared to negotiate on doing the right thing in terms from shelf to field through the sustainability lens. So of course, we've got the programs that you'll know about of cocoa and Harmony Wheat, where we're doing the impact piece that's bigger and with our supply base and a really, really strong partnerships there. But equally well, we haven't moved back, and the pandemic hasn't changed our focus on making sure that we're using our resources in the best possible way that we can through energy and water and everything else. We include, to your point about supplier audits and audits in general, then yes, of course, there has been some pushback at the start of all of this, of how do you access, how do you travel, how do you access, how do you keep making sure that everything's okay, both through the food safety and the performance of the external manufacturers, but also through things like human labor and all that, and the kind of areas that you were operating in which the supply chain gets in. Our commitment, which we are also talking to our suppliers about, is that we will find a way to be able to keep those audits alive and do those audits. Rely something on them, of course, because we rely on ourselves in terms of auditing as well, but build on that by making sure that physically we're where we need to be when we need to be for audit. So that is something we're working on at the moment, and in partnership with the quality organisation that one of my colleagues runs, Rob, we're working on how do we make that happen using our footprint, which stretches across the globe anyway. So we are pretty much everywhere, which means accessing some of our third-party suppliers or some of the rest of our supply chain is not such a big deal as if we were just in one central location. So we are committed to doing that and finding a way to make that happen.
Any early learnings there, even in terms of sort of compliance and audits, but also just in terms of, you know, supplier relations virtually, really changes the game. Do you have any early learnings on how to keep that on track?
Yeah, definitely. So at the very start of all of this, and if you look at some of the countries that we operate in, Malaysia, of course we've got Europe, we've got Malaysia, we've got India, we've got Latin America, we've got all over the place. Actually, what we saw very early on was if we have the strength of relationship, then we're able to manage and work together. So we've got examples around the world of where at the very start of all of this, I wrote to all of our key suppliers to say how important they were to us and how we wanted to help them as well to keep going. So you make it quite personal because they are incredibly important to our success and for us to get to those consumers and customers that want our product. And then we talked about, so how do we help each other? So where we were trying to operate in places that were under lockdown and some of the authorities were quite rightly preserving their environment, and we were getting permission to be able to operate because we were first line workers, how did we help our suppliers to also be part of that supply chain? So it really was about extending the supply chain and creating that environment where we were one and the same, and we had many areas of success where we were able to do that because we were one supply chain, irrespective of whether we had Mondelēz at the start of our name or whether people were working on behalf. And that was really down to relationships. It was down to relationships internally in Mondelēz, working with our legal division and our local business units as well as the supply chain. And it was also down to how hard the suppliers would work with and for us. So again, we managed to accelerate and really build deeper relationships with those suppliers that were able to do that. And now we're looking at, okay, so how do we strategically manage as we move out of where we've been in Mondelēz in procurement, which has probably been more around the tactical type of thing. How do we build on what we've learned through the pandemic to identify those suppliers that are going to be key and strategic and part of our family moving forward to do the kind of things that we've done in the last 6 months.
Gotcha. So what I'm hearing is that the pandemic was really just a surprise exam to prove what you'd already learned in the last 10 years for any supply chain.
Yeah, I think that would be a good way to, I mean, being in supply chain, we have never had so many plaudits in our lives as we've had in the last 6 months. So if we could frame the thank yous, because nobody ever talks about supply chain unless it's apart from us in supply chain. So now we've got this space where people can see that if you can manage and absorb that, and in supply chain, we are people who are used to volatility and turbulence. No one day is the same, which is probably why we're in it. So yes, the pandemic is an awful situation, but if any set of functions could manage it in a way that you could absorb some of the shock, I think that's what you saw in the supply chain. So we were able to bring the best, and we continuously learn in the supply chain anyway, and so iterate that as we go to get to a place where it's not easy by a long way, but where we could feel that we could breathe actually after a little bit of time rather than run like mad to get everything to work.
Wonderful. Well, I hope we find a way to get an update at the other side of that 25% SKU cut, because that'll be...
Me too. I'll let you know if we've done it.
Yeah, I'll hold you to it. Sandra MacQuillan, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Emma. Thank you.